This is the Code to Cash podcast.
Pricing is not a billing problem. Pricing is a code problem. Pricing is a product.
Price point is really the last thing that actually even matters.
You need to have the most atomic unit of your product, not your product.
Hello, welcome to the Code to Cash podcast. We are your hosts Ajit and Dor, and today we have Scott Williamson, who's a product advisor. He's been the chief product officer at GitLab. He's also been a vice president of product at SendGrid, Twilio, and a bunch of other startups and companies before that. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us today, Scott.
Thanks for having me. It's a fun topic.
Yes.
Hey, Scott.
Hey, Dor.
Well, I'm excited to have you here with us on the show. We've been knowing each other for a while now, and I still haven't got the chance to kind of get your story and kind of listen to your story firsthand. So why don't we kickstart the conversation, kind of learn, have our audience hear from you about your background and, tell us a little bit about your story.
Sure. Yeah, I live in Boulder, Colorado. We moved here almost 18 years ago to raise a family. We now have a junior in high school, a son who's 16, and a daughter who's a senior and going to be 18 in about a week.
Wow.
Professionally, as Ajit mentioned, I've pivoted towards product advisory. I left GitLab in March, and since then have started to take on product advisory engagements, and I'm now working with about 15 companies that range in maturity from seed through nearly public. It's been a lot of fun to step into that mode and help other people do their best work as product and startup leaders. So that's been a really fun change of pace. Prior to that, I was chief product officer at GitLab for 3 years. Where I owned pricing, among other things. Prior to that, I had a 6-year run at SendGrid, which was ultimately acquired by Twilio, and also had a chance to build out a pricing team there. So have owned or thought a lot about pricing for the last 9 or 10 years. And
it's just a little bit.
Subject that's near and dear to my heart that has made a big impact for SendGrid and GitLab. Personally, I live in Boulder. It's an endurance town, so I do endurance sports for fun, if you can call it that. I race Olympic distance triathlons is what I've sort of tried to be as fast as I can.
Wow.
Sweet.
Wow. Amazing. Yeah. I don't think we can match up in our personal extracurricular activities with that. But
yeah, remind me to never, sign up for that kind of activity with you. I'm pretty sure it's going to be fun to watch, but not for me, I bet.
You can keep it to a hike or something like that.
Yeah, I'm willing to wait at the end with some great coffee and some sweets, if that's...
I'll take coffee at the end.
We'll set up the stands. We'll cheer you on.
Well, I'm curious, Scott. I mean, you've been, definitely on your journey, been part of, seeing growth of highly successful SaaS companies, building out both sales-led strategies as well as, PLG, bottom-up strategies. I wonder, as you kind of, thinking out loud here about, the intersection between GTM and pricing and how this fits into, those, step-by-step growth of those companies. What are interesting stories, or even just one story that you kind of have, on your memory that you can share with us, that is something that goes along with you as you think about pricing strategy, as something that was meaningful along the growth stories of these companies?
Yeah, happy to tell as many stories as you want. I think the most impactful pricing project, it was also one of the largest and most complex, was at GitLab. We went from 4 tiers down to 3. So we had a free tier, we had a $4 tier, we called it starter, a $19 tier called premium, and a $99 tier called ultimate. And we made the tough, long decision to deprecate the $4 starter tier. It took a long time to make the decision for a lot of reasons. I'm happy to get into that. I mean, part of them were macro. We had decided to do it, and then COVID hit, and then our appetite for risk changed, and so we delayed for a while to make sure we understood what our economic situation was going to be like. There's also a huge change that impacted something like 30 or 40% of our paying users. And so we took that very seriously. There's a lot of change management involved. It was hard to get the data set we needed to make reliable decisions, because in order to make pricing decisions, you ideally have a mix of all the financial data plus product usage data. Oftentimes those aren't in the same place and requires a lot of data manipulation to pull together the data set you need to make a good decision. That all took a while. And last but not least, it's pretty hard to get alignment on a decision that big, because there's a lot of risk and different functions have different motivations. So it was a long, challenging project to line up, but we got it done. And I think we learned a lot along the way about I think we did some things well that I can share more about. Ultimately, a very successful pricing change.
So Scott, I'm curious, what size was GitLab when you had these 4 packages just before COVID, in terms of maybe revenue or employee count, and what was the history about even coming up with those, so that we sort of know what the evolution was before this change was required?
We were roughly 100 million and probably about 750 people, something like that.
Got it.
It took a good year for the whole thing to play out, so our size changed while it all was happening, because GitLab was growing fast. But nevertheless, around that time, the backstory is we had this buyer-based pricing model strategy, if you will. What we were going for was a very clear buyer target in each tier. And so backing up, we had individual contributors was for free. The starter was for managers. The premium was for directors, and ultimate was for executives. Part of the problem, there were several problems with starter. One was that the distinction between what a director needs and what a manager needs is not clear. And so we ended up having not enough distinction between what was in starter versus what it was in premium. And it was a 5 times price jump from 4 to 19. And so we ultimately, the starter package was way too sticky. There wasn't enough up tiers up to premium, but we felt like we were offering more, way more than even $19 worth of value. So it was a bad economic place for our customers to end up. Also compounded by running a SaaS offering increased our cost on that side. And so for a $4 user on SaaS, it was not a good look economically. And so but ultimately, I think the root cause was that there wasn't enough distinction between the manager and the director. And we ultimately decided that having an individual contributor, manager / director, and exec, having 3 packages rather than 4 made more sense, and it was made it clearer where someone should land, and it improved unit economics a lot.
Understood. So I'm guessing, and may feel free to, add your own viewpoint on what the biggest challenges were. Just from hearing the story, it sounds like the migration of existing customers to a higher, like it would, you would imagine that you'd have some churn, and then customers would move to higher tiers.
Yep.
Seems like that would be the most difficult aspect of this decision. I'm just curious to see how you thought through it, what sort of maybe modeling you did to anticipate what was going to happen.
Yeah, that's insightful. That was, in fact, by far the hardest part of it.
Right.
We spent a lot of time on analysis, so like I said, we had to mash together essentially a really complex forecasting model that took our current economic position and then layered in assumptions about what was going to happen around average selling price, churn, new sales, right? Because you're changing the dynamic for new buyers. You're forcing a decision on up tier for current customers.
Yep.
And both of them probably were going to end up impacting both average selling price as well as churn rate. And so
Yep.
we did our best to create a model that had sensitivity analysis, so a range of outcomes, if you will, conservative, likely, best case, that kind of thinking. And there were a whole bunch of different assumptions that we had to make to decide what we thought was going to happen, and that involved a lot of back and forth of negotiation with the sales org, finance, and product. Ultimately landed on a revenue model that we could all kind of get behind, and we based our following year plans on those. We also spent a ton of time thinking through a migration plan that was customer friendly. At the end of the day, we weren't so much after this for current customer revenue capture. It was more about setting the right price for buyers going forward.
Right.
We thought that the minimum paid tier was worth way more than $19, so we were comfortable with that as sort of the lowest tier, and we wanted to start to set that. So we didn't need a huge revenue bump out of current customers. We were more focused on retention. So
Makes sense.
we offered two deals. One was you can renew at the current $4 price for a whole nother year. So whenever you come up for renewal, you can renew again at $4. And then after that, you need to pay $19 if you want to stay. That was one offer. And so that could be almost 2 years of ramp for some, but at least a year. And then the other offer was a 3-year ramp deal where they go from 4 to 6 to 9 to 15, I think was the ramp.
Okay.
And so we offered that as a way to gradually move up. And then we spent a ton of time on communications. We made sure that the whole company was ready for it. Lots of training for support and our social media team to be able to respond to things that might be going on in social media if customers got upset. So we had all hands on deck for that rollout, and ultimately it was quite smooth.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Wow, seems like such a big like surgical operation.
It was giant. Yeah, it was like landing an aircraft carrier. I mean, it was.
Wow.
It was a huge project.
I'm curious. I'm just gonna I just really want to dig deeper and understand a few more aspects, if you're all right with this. You mentioned most of this modeling was done from a future anticipation perspective, like. You felt the product had certain amount of value, and what informed that value? Was it a competitive set? Like what sort of analysis gave you confidence in the value being delivered or the willingness to pay of that particular segment?
Several things. One was we had a really low discount rate on the $19 package, so that gave us confidence that. That we had a belief that, again, there's not much of a difference between a manager and a director buyer, and that They were receiving fairly similar value, if you will, and we were seeing very low discount rates at 19. So that gave us confidence that if that were the place people were going to land, we could probably come close to holding that, and therefore increase our average selling price across the product line by a lot. That was one. We also engaged a third party that did some quant analysis, which was a super helpful input, and again gained some confidence that we were way underpriced at 4.
Makes sense.
Those were the big two.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Scott, I want to piggyback on that, and Ajit and I are part of a founders to pricing experts community, and oftentimes we get to chat with early stage to later stage founders, and one thing we hear a lot is how in many cases the organizational conversation around pricing decisions and driving what ultimately going to be a pricing change that wants to be introduced also introduces a lot of tension between the different orgs on which direction should we go and why. And so I wonder what a good advice or kind of like some learnings you can share, and what are things that can kind of smooth or make the conversation more intelligent, if you will, when it comes to starting to make those trade-offs between those different orgs, and being much more nimble in the way this change is ultimately this landing of a plane actually that takes place.
It is very tricky because there's a lot of perceived and real risk to making big pricing changes. I think the two things that have helped, 3. One, I think it's really helpful to align on what's the right word? A principles-based approach, like almost like this over that. So what are we going to favor? Like an example from the GitLab tier change was, we're going to favor current customer retention over fast revenue capture. If you can get the team to align on what you're going to favor, because you can't optimize for everything. So
I love it.
Making it clear, what are we going to optimize for? Because it's easy to bring up a complaint about something, and it's real. Like, yes, that's a downside. And if you just take one at a time, it can be really hard to talk through it. But if you can compare it back to, hey, here's what we're optimizing for, here's why that thing is in fact a problem, but it's not something we can optimize for given the rest of the puzzle. And so it can help you defuse things that might not be ideal about it, because it's not what you're optimizing for. As an example, we had several sales teams at GitLab. We had a SMB team, we had a mid-market team, we had an enterprise team. Enterprise was all over this. Like, they did not want large companies landing at $4 a tier, but SMBs, we had a lot of smaller customers land there, and so that team was more sensitive to the change, understandably. But we were optimizing for overall ASP across the whole product line, and so that helped us push through that, even though that was a valid pushback.
Makes sense.
The other tactic the second is try to do your best to make sure that everyone trusts the data set. So maybe having an independent group, maybe finance or data science or whoever your analytics team or something like that is, own it rather than product or sales or one of these teams that has a huge vested interest in it. It's just to make sure that you can trust the data set isn't biased. You're not trying to make the data say one thing or another. And then the third is, it can be really helpful to hire a third party as well. They have really deep skill in going out and getting quant data to support the decision. And B, some of them are very good at driving exec alignment. Like, they know how to they know how to make execs feel comfortable that the methodology they have is legit. that they've done this for other big companies before. Sometimes they have a certain amount of credibility that internal teams don't, for whatever reason, maybe just because the internal team hasn't done it a bunch of times.
Right.
So I've seen that really accelerate the path to alignment and decision, just because of the credibility of a third party.
Makes sense. Interesting.
Yeah, I love these advices, especially the around fundamentally internalizing that there's no such thing like the ultimate change, right? Like the one change to rule them all. Like deciding which metric are you optimizing for, and what are going to be the upsides, what are going to be the downsides of that, and basically having this hypothesis or this goal in advance sounds like something that can definitely help streamline the process right after.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and also explicitly verbalizing the trade-off is interesting, and I'm saying that because I'm actually dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, where one executive has, I want to tune for adoption, and but the CEO is saying margin,
Yeah.
and and then but everybody has their opinion. At some point, you have to put it on paper and just say, are these our principles, or are they different?
Yeah.
And then just decide and move on, because it's impossible to make everyone happy at the same time. So really appreciate that idea, Scott. Actually, I would love to, the GitLab example was great. And I think that's super valuable for people who will listen, and even for us. Well, I'm curious to even learn, if you could share another story. I know we've done more even at SendGrid, Twilio. Curious to learn like what the type of pricing examples there, and just curious to learn more about your experiences.
Yeah. There were a couple big projects, so I'll give you a choice. One was around the freemium offer. We adjusted what we offered in that a couple of times due to competitive dynamics, so happy to talk about that one. The other one was we increased the price of our lowest tier. It was called Essentials by 50%, and that was a fairly major decision as well. Which one do you want?
We're getting a lot of questions on PLG also.
Yeah, I was curious to ask about that as well, Ajit. You read my mind.
Yeah.
The freemium one?
The freemium part, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so SendGrid was PLG before there was a term for it. And, it was always pay with a credit card, developer first, set of APIs, kind of a product and kind of a go-to-market strategy. And so freemium was always there. When I joined, I think the offer was, I may miss the numbers. Let's just say it was like 5,000 email credits a month, something like that. The general idea was, let's give an individual dev enough email processing power, if you will, for them to really feel the benefit of it, so that when the time comes for them to roll it out at their company, they can move up to a paid package, and they will have been sold. So that worked great. SendGrid had a pretty decent conversion rate, but a competitor emerged. It was a sister product to MailChimp. It's called Mandrill. And so MailChimp basically rolled out a SendGrid equivalent, and they were super generous with what they were offering in free. I think it more than doubled what we were offering. I think it was 10 or 15,000 emails a month. I may be missing the numbers, but you get the point. They started giving away a ton of value in free, and we felt like we were starting to lose momentum in our free offering, which therefore impacted our conversion rate and therefore impacted our market share and revenue growth rate as a company. So we felt like we had to react so that we weren't losing the first look based on the generosity of their free plan. Fairly big decision, because the conversion rate hinges on the amount of value you provide in free, and if we were going to give away a ton more volume, it was probably going to extend the conversion time or decrease the odds of conversion. So it's a pretty big decision. But ultimately, we felt like we would rather suffer there than lose out on tomorrow's user base based on a really generous free plan. So we decided to, I think we matched them. I think we matched what they had in their free offer so that we weren't going to lose on that. And then we tried to win on other characteristics like scale and volume and email expertise and all the rest, because we were much more dedicated to the email API business. For them, it was a side project.
Interesting.
And so I think that worked. We ended up kind of winning back our foothold in the early, in the free low end. We ended up winning back a bunch of credibility in the low end. And you could see things change. You could see our free plan usage go up. Ultimately, I may be misremembering the financial impact. My memory of it is that we were better off financially because we got more people in the free offering. We ended up converting at a reasonable rate anyway, and it turned out to be the right call. We made the reverse decision a couple years later because Mandrill ended up essentially not offering their product as standalone anymore. They only offered it as an add-on to MailChimp. So you couldn't use it standalone anymore.
Yeah. And
I think that was them conceding that they didn't want to play in the broader email API business. They just wanted it to be a feature of their overall offering. So the fact that we sort of matched them and ended up winning on other grounds.
I just love this example so much. It's just, it's also like classic business school. So, it's one of those things they teach you in business school, like don't compete on price.
Yeah.
But sometimes you have to compete on price because there's a competitor who'll be willing to do things that you aren't and who are smaller.
Yeah.
But eventually they end up losing. So,
Yeah.
but the devil is in the details, I guess, right? Like if you hadn't moved, they would have gotten more of a foothold.
Yeah.
But you did move, and then once they were no longer a threat, you were able to sort of rebalance and
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, we ended up pulling it back to like 1,000 emails a month. So we pulled it down below where it was initially because they were kind of out of the game.
Yeah.
And by then we felt like we had won more or less. We were clearly the number one. And so by pulling the credits down in free, we felt like people could still have a reasonable free experience, but the trigger to up tier would happen faster, and that was also a great epic economic move at the right time.
Scott, I know it's. Oh, all right. Go ahead, Ajit.
Just one question, Dor. I'm just so interested in the example. I'm just curious, Scott, about the. Is there any principle you learned about freemium? Because freemium is such a debated topic, even before the how much to give free. A lot of founders feel pressured if they're just building out a solution and their PLG. They're feeling pressured that I need to give a lot of this away so that people will use me because you're sort of anxious. It's a new product. At the same time, if a regular pricing consultant looks at their pricing plan, they're like, well, if you give everything away for free, what do you have in your premium plan?
Yeah.
I'm just curious if you have an opinion there.
Yeah, huge opinion. I mean, look, there's probably no formula for it. You have to gauge your own situation.
Yeah.
One tactic that I think can really help is having a super clear definition of who the free plan is for. And for both SendGrid and GitLab, it was for an individual developer. And when you make that distinction clear and early, you can avoid some tiering mistakes where maybe you give things away that actually have team or enterprise or organizational value in free. And so if you have the right free plan for the right target user with the right feature set in it, that can limit your exposure later because you still have lots of degrees of freedom to serve those other segments well with your packages.
That makes so much sense. Yeah,
I think that's my number one piece of advice.
Yep.
GitLab, I think, gave away too much. We really settled on this buyer-based pricing model.
Yep.
before I joined, but way after the free plan was established, and the free plan had things in it like single sign-on and role-based permissions, and we had companies with 5,000 developers using free. Like that shouldn't, in hindsight, that probably shouldn't have happened. Now, who knows? Maybe having all those huge companies using it increased our brand halo such that, look, GitLab did fine. So it all worked out. I think GitLab had the benefit of a huge market. And not all companies have such a huge market opportunity, and mistakes on what you're giving away in free can cut deeper. So GitLab did fine again, but I think if we had gotten crisp on the IC being the target for free earlier, we would have had an even better conversion rate later.
Makes sense.
What was, because we ended up, chatting a little bit more into the GitLab story. I wonder, like, I get to chat a lot with founders that are also in the open source motion as well. What was unique, or is there anything you find unique in the open source motion when it comes to pricing?
Yeah, super unique. Well, first of all, I think the philosophy changes. GitLab's philosophy was, we're going to give away 80% of the value here, and we'll try to capture 20. A lot of companies are trying to capture 80 out of 100 or 50 out of 100 or something much higher. And so I think a lot of open source companies are sort of in that mode. You're giving away a lot just by definition because of how you've chosen the business model for the company. That's one big difference. You have to be okay with giving away a lot of value and free in an open source. 2, there are certain rules to open source that impact your ability to run traditional growth plays. For example, you can go out to GitLab and you can download our free self-hosted version, and you don't have to tell us anything. We don't know who you are. You can do whatever you want with it. It's not regulated or tracked in any way. And so it's hard to run a growth play off that. The free self-managed usage is completely disconnected from commercialization. We believe it has a huge impact. Like, we've got millions of users using GitLab, and a lot of those people show up at companies, but we can't execute against it. We can't even track it. And so that's another chip. The big benefit of being open source is if it works, you can establish a huge brand halo in the developer community because they know it. They've gotten a lot of value from you. They love you. They'll recommend you at their company. But it's much harder to run a PLG motion on it.
That's a lot of things.
Yeah. And sometimes, being able to, make turn the switch and kind of go into the commercialization, world of that same offering becomes more tricky, because you've done a lot of, groundwork establishing your open source story, and you've gained a lot of adoption throughout the story, and now, turning on the switch and doubling down on the other story becomes a little bit more tricky sometimes as well.
For sure. Yeah. I think a lot of developers are skeptical of when customers switch into commercialization mode, that they're going to lose interest, lose focus on, lose commitment to the open source project that they initially knew and loved.
Yeah.
And so you get into this mode where there's sort of this immediate trust gap that emerges. The commercial companies that started out selling their product with proprietary versions don't have to deal with.
Yeah.
So, definitely pros and cons. I think open source is a powerful model. I think over time it's probably going to take over, but there's, there are certain open source specific monetization problems that make it tricky.
Ajit, I don't know if you're cool with that, but I'm kind of curious to switch the gears from talking strategy, pricing. I'm curious I'm curious to pick Scott's brain on, when you think about implementation, what are the type of tooling or, elements in your environments that allowed you to drive those changes, in past, experiences, whether that's the freemium changes you drove at SendGrid or, those late changes at GitLab. I wonder, what are key elements in your setup and stack that allowed you to be driving those changes with ease?
Well, I wouldn't say we drove them with ease. They were all really hard. We got them done because we had a high level commitment to them. But in many cases, they were greatly delayed because it was really hard. I think the things that you need to make pricing changes, I would offer 3 things that really help. One is a dedicated pricing team, or at least a budget for pricing research to help frame it up. Because in the absence of that, it's really hard to get pricing changes right. It's hard to get them aligned. It's hard to get them sort of decided on. So having people who know the pricing game is important. 2, having a dedicated team focused on all the billing and purchasing workflow stuff is essential. When I joined GitLab, I think we had 1 or 2 engineers on the billing system. And nobody focused on all the purchasing workflows. By the time I left, we had 3 pretty large teams working on it. We added a ton of development muscle to it because it was a business mover and we needed engineering muscle behind it to be able to make it fast and flexible. So we were on that journey. We weren't all the way there yet, but we definitely made a huge financial commitment to it. So having dedicated engineering, and then the third is having a PM leader or PMs who know this stuff. We ended up with a PM for 3 PMs on the billing system, 4 PMs on growth. They were all trying to push monetization from different angles. And so we had a lot of people thinking about it, trying to understand what was happening, trying to connect the product to the business. GitLab's an extreme example because it's big, but nevertheless, dedicated PM, dedicated engineering, and possibly third-party help.
That's very interesting. Like you mentioned 3 to 4 PMs there. You mentioned a lot of development muscle. Do you share this view that companies underinvest
Almost always.
Hiring? Yeah.
Almost always, because it's not something people buy. It's a supporting function.
Yep.
And
it's infrastructure.
It's infra, and infra stuff always gets underfunded. Almost always.
Yep.
Yeah. I recently... Yeah, go ahead, Ajit.
Yeah, go ahead, Dor.
I just recently had you've mentioned it, have a dedicated pricing team, which got me hooked because I recently had a conversation with, a product director leading inside they're a growth stage company, and they are now rethinking the structure and thinking what's the best way to structure their org around pricing. Should it be under product? Should it be under the revenue organization? Who should be the actual, roles and, identities and backgrounds to be part of that team? Like lots of great questions. I wonder, for our listeners that are, on that, step that they're about to structure their team, or they have this strategic motion in place to have such a team. What would be quick tips or thoughts around the structure and the identities? Who should be part of that? You mentioned it, engineering and product, but I wonder how that team would look like from your perspective.
Well, I think where pricing should live depends to a large degree on the go-to-market motion. At GitLab, we had huge freemium offers. GitLab's was open source, SendGrid was not. But nevertheless, they were product-led companies. Let's put it that way. Having pricing in product when it's a product-led company makes a lot of sense, because I think of pricing almost as a feature of the product. It's got to flow from what the product does and what it offers. And we had PMs making tiering decisions every day. We ship like 50 things a month, and so there's 50 tiering decisions that need to be made every single month. And so having pricing in product made and still makes a lot of sense. If you're in a totally sales-led place where it's all about discounting and that kind of stuff, it might make sense to have it in sales, where you can manage pricing to discounting trends and that kind of stuff. I can imagine that working fine. But I think more and more it probably makes sense to have it in product for most modern companies that have more of a product-led approach. As far as skills, personally, I was always looking for someone who was a pricing guru, who had, maybe somebody who comes from a place like Simon Kucher or Price Intelligently or one of these firms. It can be hard to bring someone from a firm into a company. I'm not minimizing that that's an easy transition, but looking for someone who has really deep pricing expertise, because they're going to be the one educating the company on pricing. And so I wanted that first hire to really be able to be credible from that standpoint. From there you might be able to hire more junior people or bring in a data person to support them. Pricing was always, never had a direct engineering team, but they would tee up pricing change work with whoever owned the website and whoever owned the sign-up flow and whoever owned the billing systems. And you sort of tee up the project, and then you have PMs for those teams, carve up the work. So it was kind of matrixed.
All right. Yeah. Sounds like, I heard you saying, in a PLG motion, pricing is almost a feature, and I was like, yeah, you got me. So yeah, it makes total sense, I think. And, I wonder, as you think of, trends from that perspective, do you foresee that some of these elements, these structures will become more common? Like, do you foresee, as the industry, as we see more and more companies adopting some level, some extent of product-led in their GDM, do you foresee that these structures will become somewhat a pattern?
I do, yeah. I think the follow-on effect of product-led growth taking off is the bar is higher for growth and optimization. The bar is higher for digital demand gen. The bar is higher for pricing pages, sign-up flows, onboarding. All that stuff has to work well. And so I think pricing teams will be common. I think growth teams will be common. I think digital demand gen teams will be common. Some of those are pretty common already, but I think any product-led growth will have all three of those. Towards the end of my tenure at GitLab, I actually decided to hire a new role, and I did not see many examples of this, but I can imagine this becoming more common. I call it the role was VP of Product Monetization, and what I wanted was a counterpart to the VP of Product Management. So VP of PM owns the product experience and feature function and sort of all of that. To own that plus all the go-to-market stuff is a huge job. So I wanted and eventually hired someone to own pricing, growth, and all the billing stuff. I wanted someone thinking about how are we going to monetize what we have all day long. Because
I love that answer so much. It's
I can't. I was holding myself so I won't interrupt. But yeah.
Totally. This is why Noah and I even started this whole podcast. So you almost hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
From what we think is required.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that role is pretty common in 3 years.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I know we're sort of running up into the end of our call, so really appreciate you taking the time. I think if you were to leave maybe founders, executives or head of product with some sort of message or some advice on how to think about pricing, or ranging from the importance of the activity to the investment to the outcomes, what would be your messages to founders in general?
I think the main thing I see founders struggling with is, well, first of all, it's product market fit. And then secondly, it's what go to market motion do I want? And I think a lot of newish founders really want product led. They want a product led approach, but sometimes the traction they're seeing doesn't always fit. Like, I'm working with several companies where I think they really prefer to be product led, but they're seeing a lot of traction in enterprise sales where you need sort of bespoke engagements and all the rest. And that creates a lot of confusion when you're early and you're trying to be product led and sales led. That leads to a lot of confusion. Because then, your product could potentially go different ways. Your buying paths are bifurcated. It gets really complicated. So I guess my larger advice is focus on product market fit first. Find it. Commit to a segment. And then base your go-to-market motion on how that segment wants to buy.
Yep.
If you can line those things up in that order, it's a much orderly path to growth. But when you haven't found product market fit to a large degree, people start trying all this other stuff to try to fix that.
Yep.
And they become too distracted and undisciplined about finding product market fit. Maybe they're trying to serve 5 different users at the same time. So I think that's the path to sane pricing, is knowing who your target buyer is, and then do everything around serving them well.
100%.
Right on.
Could not agree more. Any last questions, Tor, from your end?
I think I won't add anything to that. So
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much again, Scott, for the time. I know we've learned a lot. I know folks who listen to this will learn a lot. Really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for.
thank you, Scott.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.